Hey guys, the strange thing about medieval streets is not simply that they were filthy. It is that much of the dirt, smell, mud, waste, smoke, and animal mess made practical sense to the people living with it. What looks to us like neglect was often the result of crowded towns, limited technology, working animals, narrow lanes, and a world where almost everything useful also produced some kind of waste. Before we step into that world, tell me where you are watching from and what history topic you would like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history told in a calm way, liking the video is a simple way to support it. And if you would like more quietly fascinating history for evenings, sleep, or background listening, you are warmly invited to subscribe. Now, let us walk slowly into the medieval street, not as tourists looking for dirt, but as people trying to understand why that dirt belonged there. To a modern person, the first shock of a medieval town would probably not be the castle, the church tower, or the timber houses leaning over the street. It would be the ground underfoot. Many streets were not paved in the clean, even way we imagine a city street today. They could be packed earth, broken stone, timber, gravel, or a rough mixture of whatever materials the town could afford to maintain. After rain, they became mud. After frost, they became rutted and hard. After carts, hooves, boots, and market traffic passed over them for days, they could turn into a thick layer of churned soil, straw, dung, ash, spilled food, and household sweepings. And yet, people did not experience this as a single dramatic failure. They experienced it as the ordinary surface of life. A medieval street was not only a place for walking. It was also a workplace, a marketplace, a passage for animals, a drainage channel, a meeting place, a delivery route, and sometimes an extension of the house itself. The modern separation between private interior, public pavement, sanitation system, traffic road, commercial zone, and waste disposal simply did not exist in the same way. One lane might carry a baker's customers in the morning, pigs in the afternoon, wastewater from a house at dusk, and a cartload of firewood before nightfall. This is the first thing modern viewers often misunderstand. Medieval people were not blind to smell. They were not incapable of disgust. They did not enjoy living among filth as if dirt meant nothing to them. They complained, fined one another, passed regulations, swept thresholds, dug gutters, appointed street officials, and sometimes forced neighbors to move waste. But their standards were built around what was possible, not around what a modern city can hide underground. They lived in a world where water had to be carried, animals had to stand close to homes, fuel made smoke, leather and cloth trades produced foul leftovers, and the street absorbed much of what the town could not yet remove efficiently. So when we ask why medieval streets were filthy and why nobody complained, the answer is more interesting than the title suggests. People did complain, but they complained inside a system where filth was not one problem. It was many small, stubborn problems attached to food, work, transport, heating, markets, animals, weather, poverty, and law. A town could punish a person for dumping waste in the wrong place and still remain dirty by modern standards. It could have civic pride and still smell strongly in summer. It could have rules about keeping the streets clear while allowing trades that made the streets unpleasant because those trades were necessary to daily survival. Imagine entering a growing town in late medieval Europe on a damp morning. The first light is not yet strong. The upper floors of houses project over the lane, making the street below feel narrower than it is. Wooden signs swing above shop fronts. A few shutters open. Smoke begins to slip from roof vents and hearths. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marks the hour, not with the precision of a phone clock, but with the rhythm of a community that knows time by labor, prayer, markets, meals, and daylight. Under your feet, the ground is uneven. In some places, stones have been laid down to make the passage firmer. In other places, the surface is worn into dips where rainwater gathers. A gutter may run along the middle or the side of the street, carrying dirty water away when it can, and trapping it when it cannot. Straw may have been thrown down to soak up mud or soften the ground. But straw does not make filth disappear. It hides it for a while, absorbs it, and becomes part of the street's smell. The smell is layered. There is wood smoke, which many medieval people would have associated not only with discomfort, but with warmth, cooking, and survival. There is the smell of animals, because horses, oxen, pigs, dogs, chickens, and geese were not separate from urban life. There is damp timber, ale, bread, fish, refuse, soap-making, tanning, wool, manure, human sweat, and the sharper scent of urine in corners and alleys. Not every street smelled the same. A lane near butchers would be different from one near cloth workers. A wealthy commercial street would be different from a cramped alley. A town after a dry week would feel different from a town after heavy rain. But the basic reality remained. The medieval street was an open, breathing surface, constantly receiving the byproducts of human life. One reason it became so dirty was that medieval towns were dense in a very physical way. Houses could be crowded close together. Upper stories sometimes jutted over the street, reducing light and airflow below. Shops opened directly onto the road. Goods were stored in front of buildings. Craftsmen worked where customers could see them. People did not simply pass through the street. They occupied it. A smith might work near his doorway. A seller might display vegetables, cloth, tools, or cooked food. A child might run between carts. A servant might carry water. A pig might root near a pile of scraps until someone drove it away. The street was alive, but that life produced mess. Modern cities often move waste away from public view through pipes, sewers, sealed bins, collection trucks, zoning rules, and industrial sites kept far from homes. Medieval towns lacked most of that invisible machinery. Waste stayed close because life stayed close. The useful and the unpleasant were often only a few steps apart. This is especially clear with animals. To us, the idea of livestock moving through city streets can feel like a picturesque detail, something charming in an old painting. But animals were engines, food sources, transport systems, and household assets. Horses pulled carts and carried riders. Oxen moved heavy loads. Pigs consumed scraps. Chickens and geese provided eggs, meat, and feathers. Dogs guarded, scavenged, and followed people through the lanes. These animals were useful, but they did not pause their bodies for urban cleanliness. They left droppings where they stood. They knocked things aside. They attracted flies. They made noise. They blocked narrow passages. Their bedding, feed, and waste had to go somewhere. Dung itself was not always considered useless filth. That is one of the quiet reversals at the heart of the topic. Manure could be valuable. It could be gathered for fields, gardens, and fuel in some contexts. Waste from animals in the right place had agricultural worth. The problem was that a medieval street was often the wrong place before it became the right material. Something could be both useful and disgusting, both tolerated and regulated, both part of an economy and part of a nuisance. The same was true of many trades. A town's prosperity depended on work that modern people would prefer to keep far away from where they sleep. Butchers slaughtered and cut meat. Fishmongers sold fish that spoiled quickly. Tanners transformed animal hides into leather using processes that could smell deeply unpleasant. Dyers used water, heat, minerals, plants, and sometimes substances modern people would not want near their homes. Fullers cleaned and thickened woolen cloth, a vital trade in many towns, but one that could involve strong smells and dirty liquids. Brewers, bakers, smiths, chandlers, soap makers, and countless small producers all generated smoke, ash, scraps, wastewater, and refuse. A clean town in the modern sense would have required not just more sweeping, but a different arrangement of the economy. It would have required moving trades, changing fuel, building better drains, regulating animals more strictly, paying for maintenance, supplying more water, and enforcing rules consistently across people of different wealth and influence. Some towns tried parts of this. Authorities ordered streets to be kept clear. They restricted dumping. They required householders to clean in front of their properties. They created paving obligations, appointed officials, or fined offenders. But enforcement was uneven, and the pressures of daily life returned every morning. The medieval town did not become dirty once. It became dirty again and again. That daily repetition matters. A cart enters with vegetables, straw, sacks, or timber. A horse leaves dung. A household throws out dirty water. A market stall drops leaves, bones, scales, or broken scraps. A rain shower pushes waste downhill, but also spreads it. A dog drags something away. A child steps around a puddle. A woman carrying water lifts her skirt slightly from the mud. A man complains that his neighbor has blocked the gutter. Someone sweeps a doorway, pushing dirt outward, not eliminating it. By evening, the lane has collected another day. And then darkness comes. In a world without modern street lighting, filth became more than unpleasant. It became difficult to see. A street that was merely muddy by day could become hazardous at night. Holes, ruts, refuse, loose stones, and open channels were harder to avoid. People carried lamps or torches if they could. Many simply limited movement after dark unless necessity, work, danger, or celebration pulled them outside. Even then, the street was not a clean corridor. It was a shifting surface of obstacles. Rain was one of the great forces in this environment. It could cleanse and ruin at the same time. A heavy rain might wash some waste away from one part of town, but it would carry it into another. Low streets collected runoff. Open gutters overflowed. Mud thickened where wheels cut into the ground. In dry weather, dust could rise, mixed with ash and powdered waste. In winter, frozen muck could harden into ridges. In thaw, the same streets could become soft and foul again. Cleanliness was not only a matter of human behavior. It was a struggle against weather, surfaces, gravity, and inadequate infrastructure. Still, it would be wrong to imagine every medieval street as a permanent swamp of filth. Conditions varied widely. Large, wealthy cities could invest more in paving and regulation. Important commercial streets were sometimes maintained more carefully because trade depended on access and reputation. Areas near elite buildings, markets, bridges, or civic centers might receive more attention. Some towns had channels, drains, or watercourses that helped move waste. Religious houses, guilds, and wealthy residents might keep certain spaces more orderly. But even where improvement existed, the underlying system remained fragile. Cleanliness depended on constant labor, and labor cost time, money, authority, and cooperation. The most revealing point is that medieval people often thought about cleanliness locally rather than universally. The threshold of a house mattered. The front of a shop mattered. A market space mattered on market day. A churchyard might be treated differently from a work lane. A well or conduit needed protection because water mattered. But the idea that an entire town should present a uniformly sanitized surface was not yet realistic. People protected what was most urgent, most sacred, most visible, or most enforceable. This is why complaints did exist, but they often took a practical form. A person complained because a neighbor's waste blocked a gutter. A street was impassable. A butcher's refuse created a nuisance. A dung heap stood too close. A ditch overflowed. A smell became too strong. A dangerous obstruction threatened carts or pedestrians. These were not abstract complaints about urban hygiene in the modern public health language. They were complaints about inconvenience, property, honor, trade, danger, smell, and responsibility. Public health itself was understood differently. Medieval people did not have germ theory as we know it. They did not understand bacteria, viruses, or contamination in modern scientific terms. But that does not mean they were indifferent to foul air, dirty water, or decay. Many believed bad smells and corrupted air could harm the body. They worried about miasma, imbalance, rot, and pollution in ways that sometimes led to sensible action, even if the explanation was not modern. They could connect stench with danger. They could recognize that certain waste was offensive or unhealthy. Their reasoning was different but not stupid. This distinction is important because shallow versions of medieval history often make people in the past look foolish. They say, almost with a smirk, that people threw everything into the street and nobody cared. The deeper truth is more human. People cared about many things, but they lived within limits. They had limited water, limited municipal budgets, limited enforcement tools, limited scientific knowledge, and limited separation between productive work and domestic life. Their streets were dirty not because everyone was careless, but because their world placed almost every process of survival in public view. Take household wastewater. In a modern home, dirty water disappears through drains. In a medieval house, water had to be fetched, used carefully, and then removed. Washing dishes, cleaning tools, preparing food, laundering cloth, tending animals, brewing, cooking, and basic domestic routines all created liquids that had to go somewhere. Some could be thrown into a yard, pit, channel, or street. Rules might forbid dumping at certain times or places, but enforcement depended on neighbors noticing, officials acting, and alternatives existing. When alternatives were inconvenient, expensive, or absent, the street received what the household could not store. The famous image of people emptying chamber pots from windows has some basis in urban life, but it is often exaggerated into a cartoon. Human waste could be disposed of in privies, cesspits, latrines, rivers, dung carts, or designated places, depending on location and wealth. Some houses had better arrangements than others. Monasteries and elite residences could have more sophisticated systems. But in crowded neighborhoods, especially where drainage was poor and maintenance difficult, waste management remained a serious problem. The shocking part is not that everyone constantly threw human waste into the street. The shocking part is that even when a town tried to manage it, the margin between order and foulness was thin. Cesspits needed emptying. Privies could leak. Rivers could become polluted. Ditches could clog. Night soil collectors or scavengers could remove waste. But their labor was dirty, low status, and not always sufficient. A town might have laws about where refuse should go, but laws do not shovel a pit, repair a drain, or pay a worker by themselves. Behind every rule stood the question that follows every city in history. Who will do the unpleasant work, who will pay for it, and who will be forced to obey? That question brings us to class. Medieval filth was not experienced equally. The poor often lived closer to the worst smells, the narrowest lanes, the least maintained surfaces, and the most crowded housing. Wealthier people could sometimes avoid the dirtiest routes, live in better-built houses, pay servants to carry water and waste, or pressure authorities to improve their surroundings. But even the rich could not fully escape the town's smell. A noble visitor entering a busy city still passed animals, mud, smoke, and trades. Wealth softened discomfort. It did not erase the medieval environment. For ordinary workers, the street's dirt was part of the body's daily negotiation with the world. Shoes might be poor or worn. Clothing could drag near mud. Hands touched tools, doors, carts, animals, food, and surfaces that modern hygiene would keep separate. People cleaned themselves and their belongings as best they could, but cleanliness had to compete with fatigue, cost, water access, fuel, and time. A person who had worked all day could not simply run a hot shower, wash clothes in a machine, and seal rubbish into a plastic bag. Recovery itself took labor, and yet, life went on with remarkable organization. Markets opened, bread was baked, ale was brewed, cloth was sold, children learned routes through the town, apprentices carried goods, servants rose early, bells rang, courts met, churches filled, marriages, funerals, contracts, punishments, festivals, and bargains all took place within this sensory world. The filth did not stop society. It shaped society. This is where the topic becomes more than a description of unpleasant streets. It becomes a way of seeing medieval urban life as a constant balancing act between necessity and nuisance. The same animals that dirted the street pulled the cart that brought food. The same trades that stank produced leather, cloth, candles, soap, tools, and meat. The same watercourses that carried waste might also support work. The same crowded lanes that trapped smell also created commerce, neighborhood identity, and safety through familiarity. Medieval towns were not dirty because they lacked society. They were dirty because society was intensely physical. The street was where the town revealed its true economy. Not the polished version written in charters, not the ideal city imagined in sermons, not the clean stone silhouette seen from a distance, but the working organism. Eating, selling, sweating, hauling, spilling, repairing, arguing, sweeping, and beginning again. To walk through it was to walk through the consequences of survival before modern infrastructure learned to hide those consequences underground. And perhaps that is the quiet reason this subject holds our attention. Medieval filth feels distant, almost unbelievable, until we recognize that every modern city still produces waste, smell, runoff, sewage, smoke, noise, and dirt. We have not abolished the problem. We have moved it into pipes, treatment plants, landfills, industrial zones, sealed containers, and labor systems most people rarely see. The medieval street shocks us because it shows the same processes without concealment. But before we become too comfortable judging it, we have to look more closely at the people whose job it was to keep this world barely manageable. The sweepers, scavengers, rakers, carters, officials, neighbors, servants, and low-status workers who stood between a dirty street and a completely unusable one. Their work was often unnoticed when it succeeded and blamed when it failed, and it opens the next part of the story, because medieval urban filth was not only a problem of waste. It was also a problem of responsibility. Responsibility in a medieval town rarely belonged to one person alone. It moved uneasily between householders, landlords, tenants, craft workers, market officials, parish officers, town councils, servants, and the people hired to do the work nobody else wanted to touch. A street could be called public, but the duty to keep it passable was often local, personal, and uneven. The householder might be expected to clean the space before his door. A shopkeeper might be blamed if goods, scraps, or wastewater blocked the way. A craft guild might be watched if its trade produced especially unpleasant remains. A civic officer might inspect a lane, issue a warning, or demand a fine. But between rule and reality there was always the same stubborn distance. Dirt returned faster than authority could remove it. This is one of the quieter truths about medieval urban life. The street did not stay filthy simply because no one cared. It stayed filthy because cleanliness had to be produced every day by hands, tools, carts, orders, habits, and payment. Sweeping a lane was not a single act of improvement. It was a repeated battle against animals, weather, markets, household routines, and the pressure of too many people using too little space. A town could wake with the intention of order and end the day with mud in the gutters, straw trampled into the road, and refuse waiting for someone else's attention. The people who stood at the center of that battle were often socially invisible. They appear in records as rakers, scavengers, sweepers, carters, dung collectors, or men and women ordered to cleanse a passage, clear a ditch, or remove an obstruction. Their names, when they survive at all, are not usually the names around which grand history is built. They were not kings, bishops, or famous merchants. Yet without them, the medieval town would have become nearly impossible to move through. They were part of the hidden machinery of urban survival, the human substitute for systems that later centuries would bury under stone, brick, iron, and pipe. A raker's work might involve gathering street waste into heaps, moving it by cart, clearing channels, or taking dung and refuse toward places where it could be dumped or reused. This work could be unpleasant, tiring, and low in status, but it was also necessary. In some towns, waste had value if it could be carried beyond the crowded center and used on fields or gardens. The same material that made a street offensive might become part of the rural economy. So the removal of filth was not always simple disposal. It could be a small trade, a civic service, a punishment, an obligation, or a negotiated right. That is why medieval waste sometimes followed routes of its own. It moved from house to street, from street to heap, from heap to cart, from cart to field, ditch, riverbank, or dumping ground. Each movement depended on labor. Each delay made the problem worse. If the raker did not come, if the cart broke, if weather turned the heap to sludge, if a householder refused to pay, if a neighbor moved waste only as far as the next frontage, then the town's fragile order began to fail. The street was not just dirty. It was a place where cooperation could be seen breaking down. Town authorities knew this. Medieval civic records, especially from larger towns and cities, show repeated concern with blocked lanes, offensive trades, clogged gutters, wandering animals, dangerous pits, and refuse in places where it should not be. There were fines for dumping, orders to repair paving, instructions to clean before doors, and restrictions on where certain waste could be placed. In some places, officials could walk the streets and identify nuisances. In others, complaints came through neighbors, courts, ward meetings, or local custom. The exact system varied widely, but the concern itself was real. Yet the existence of rules should not fool us into imagining that rules created cleanliness. Many medieval ordinances sound firm because the problem was persistent. A law repeated many times is often a sign that people kept ignoring it, resisting it, forgetting it, or finding it impossible to obey. If a town had to repeatedly order residents not to throw refuse into certain streets or watercourses, that does not mean the town had solved the matter. It means the same behavior kept returning because it was convenient, cheap, and built into ordinary life. There was also the question of fairness. Who had to clean? Who could avoid the dirtiest work? Who had enough influence to shift nuisance away from his own property and toward someone else's? In a narrow lane, one household's waste could become another household's doorway problem. A wealthy merchant might have servants to manage mess, while a poor tenant had fewer options. A butcher, brewer, or tanner might be essential to the town's economy, but deeply unpopular to nearby residents. Civic authority had to balance trade and comfort, profit and smell, private need and public passage. This is one reason complaints were often so practical. A medieval person was less likely to complain that the entire town failed to meet an abstract ideal of sanitation, and more likely to complain that a neighbor's heap blocked access, that foul water ran where it should not, that animals damaged property, or that a trade created an unbearable nuisance in a specific place. The complaint was local because the problem was local. The street was experienced from the doorway outward, and the doorway mattered. The threshold of a medieval house was not merely an architectural line. It was a border between household order and public uncertainty. Inside, however cramped or smoky, a family might try to maintain some measure of control. Bedding, storage, tools, food, fire, clothing, small possessions, and domestic routines. Outside, the street belonged to everyone and therefore to no one completely. What crossed the threshold from inside to outside did not vanish. It became part of a shared problem. Sweepings pushed out of one house could become the mud under another person's shoes. The tension between private and public was especially clear in markets. Market days gave life to a town. They brought food, news, credit, gossip, work, and taxes. They connected countryside and urban center. But they also produced intense mess in a short time. Vegetables shed leaves and roots. Fish and meat stalls required cleaning. Animals moved through crowds. Broken baskets, straw, spilled grain, ashes from cooking, and muddy footprints collected quickly. A successful market was supposed to be busy, but busyness itself was dirty. Authorities cared about market cleanliness not only because of smell, but because markets were tied to reputation and order. A town that could not keep its main market passable risked more than discomfort. It risked trade. Buyers needed space to move. Sellers needed confidence. Officials needed to collect fees. Goods needed to be displayed without being ruined underfoot. Here, filth became economic. Too much dirt could interfere with profit, and profit was often a stronger force than taste. Still, even in market spaces, medieval cleanliness was practical rather than pristine. The aim was not to create a spotless surface. The aim was to keep the place usable. A lane had to be passable. A drain had to carry water. A stall had to operate. Cart had to turn. A person had to reach the church, the bridge, the well, the shop, or the gate. If the street functioned, people tolerated a level of dirt that would overwhelm modern expectations. Function came before comfort. This is one of the most important expectation reversals. Medieval streets were not always seen as failed spaces because they were dirty. They were judged more often by whether they could still serve their purpose. Could people pass? Could carts move? Could animals be driven through? Could goods be sold? Could water run away rather than sit endlessly? Could a procession pass on a feast day? Could a fire be reached? Could the town continue? Dirt became intolerable when it interfered too sharply with use, status, health as they understood it, or neighborly obligation. The same logic shaped paving. Paving was expensive. Stone had to be obtained, transported, laid, repaired, and maintained. Wealthier streets, important routes, bridges, and market centers often had better surfaces than poorer lanes. But paving was not magic. Stones could loosen, gaps filled with mud, waste still collected, animals still passed, rain still found low points. A paved street might be more durable, but it was not automatically clean. Without sweeping and drainage, stone became simply a harder surface on which filth could accumulate. Drainage was even more difficult. Some medieval streets had open gutters or channels, sometimes running along the sides, sometimes down the middle. To modern eyes, a central gutter can seem shocking, as if the town deliberately placed filth in the path of daily life. But in a narrow street without underground sewers, a visible channel was also a practical solution. It gave water somewhere to go. It made flow possible. It showed, in a rough and imperfect way, that people were trying to manage movement. Not only the movement of bodies and carts, but the movement of dirty water. The trouble was that open drainage required constant attention. A gutter filled with straw, dung, ash, and scraps stopped being drainage and became a long, foul obstruction. If one household kept its section clear and another did not, the whole line could fail. If a street had poor slope, water lingered. If rain was too heavy, the channel overflowed. If waste was thrown in carelessly, it blocked the very system meant to carry waste away. Medieval infrastructure was often not absent. It was vulnerable. And because it was vulnerable, responsibility had to be enforced through social pressure as much as law. Neighbors watched one another. People knew who kept a frontage reasonably clear and who did not. Reputation mattered in a town where business, credit, marriage, apprenticeship, and friendship all depended on local knowledge. A household that created a nuisance might be resented not only because it smelled, but because it failed in the basic duty of living among others. Filth, in this sense, was moral as well as material. Could signal disorder, laziness, poverty, disregard, or simply lack of power. But we should be careful here. Poverty itself often produced dirt, not because the poor lacked concern, but because they had fewer resources for managing it. A poorer household might live in tighter quarters, own fewer vessels, have less access to secure storage, struggle to pay for repairs, or lack servants who could carry waste away. The poorest residents were more likely to live where maintenance was weakest and complaints carried less influence. To blame them morally for dirt would miss the structure that trapped them near it. At the same time, wealthier households produced waste too, sometimes more of it. Larger homes, more servants, more animals, more food preparation, more fuel, and more consumption all created their own streams of refuse. Wealth could conceal waste by moving it through servants and back spaces, but it did not eliminate it. This is a recurring pattern in urban history. The people with power are often better at relocating discomfort than abolishing it. Servants played a central role in that relocation. Much of the carrying, cleaning, fetching, emptying, and sweeping that made daily life possible fell to lower status members of the household. They carried water in, carried dirty water out, tended fires, managed ashes, moved bedding, cleaned vessels, handled animals, and took responsibility for tasks their employers did not wish to do. The cleaner appearance of a wealthier home or frontage often rested on someone else's repetitive labor. Ash was one of those ordinary materials that shaped the street in quiet ways. Fires were everywhere because heat, cooking, baking, brewing, smithing, and craft production depended on them. Ash could be useful in some contexts, but it was also dust, residue, and waste. Could be swept out, stored, reused, sold, or scattered. Along with soot and smoke, it formed part of the gray texture of medieval urban air and surfaces. Again, the useful and the dirty were bound together. A warm hearth meant smoke. Cooked food meant scraps. Light meant tallow, wax, oil, or flame, each with its own smell and residue. Water, by contrast, was precious. Modern people often imagine cleanliness as mainly a question of willingness. If something is dirty, clean it. But in a medieval town, cleaning required water that had to be drawn, carried, heated if necessary, and used carefully. Wells, conduits, rivers, rain barrels, and streams all mattered, but access varied. Carrying water was heavy work. Heating water required fuel. Fuel cost money or labor. Washing a surface, a garment, or a body was never free in the way it can feel free when a tap turns easily. This practical limit shaped expectations. People did wash. They cleaned hands, faces, tools, dishes, garments, and domestic spaces in many contexts. But they had to choose. Not every mess could be treated with equal urgency. Water used for one task was not available for another without more labor. A household might prioritize cooking, brewing, laundering, animals, or personal washing depending on need, season, status, and access. The street, being shared and constantly dirted, often lost that competition. The water supply itself also needed protection. A town might tolerate mud in many lanes while fiercely guarding a well or conduit from contamination. This tells us something important. Medieval people were not indifferent to the quality of water. They might not understand disease in modern terms, but they knew that foul water was dangerous, unpleasant, and socially disruptive. Regulations around wells, fountains, conduits, and rivers were often stricter because water was too important to abandon completely to filth. Rivers, however, created another contradiction. They were lifelines for transport, power, trade, fishing, washing, and certain crafts. They were also convenient places to dump unwanted matter. A river carried things away from the immediate eye, which made it tempting. But what was carried away from one person could become another person's problem downstream. The river made disposal feel possible, but it also spread contamination and nuisance across a wider landscape. The medieval city therefore lived in a constant negotiation with movement. Waste moved through streets, gutters, carts, rivers, animals, servants, and weather. The aim was rarely perfect removal. It was distance. Move it away from the doorway. Move it away from the market. Move it beyond the wall. Move it downstream. Move it to the field. Move it somewhere less visible, less offensive, less immediately dangerous. The history of urban cleanliness is partly the history of pushing unpleasant things just far enough away. But distance could be political. No one wanted the dump too close. No one wanted the foul trade beside his house, unless he profited from it or lacked the power to object. Town edges, poorer quarters, riverbanks, ditches, and marginal spaces often carried the burden. The city center might be defended, improved, and ceremonially cleaned for processions or visits, while less visible neighborhoods remained neglected. Cleanliness followed status. Ceremonial moments reveal this clearly. Before major religious processions, civic events, royal entries, or important market occasions, towns might make special efforts to clear streets, decorate fronts, remove obstructions, and present a more orderly face. These moments did not mean the town was usually clean. They show that people understood appearance, smell, and order as part of dignity. When it mattered, they could mobilize labor. The problem was sustaining that standard when the festival ended, the visitors left, and ordinary work returned. There is something deeply human in this. People in the past, like people now, often cleaned most intensely when being seen. The daily lane might be tolerated in a rough state, but the route of a procession, the front of a guild hall, the entrance to a church, or the street used by a visiting lord might receive special attention. Public cleanliness was not only about health or convenience. It was about honor, hierarchy, display, and the story a town told about itself. Churches occupied a complicated place in this landscape. They were spiritual centers, social centers, and visual landmarks. The space around them could be crowded with people, burials, markets, animals, and movement depending on the time and place. A churchyard might be treated with reverence, but it was also part of town life. Paths, walls, gates, and nearby stalls had to be managed. The sacred did not float above the material world. It stood among mud, bells, smoke, bodies, and the constant need to keep passage open. Monasteries and religious houses sometimes had more organized systems for water and waste, especially larger institutions with resources, land, and long-term planning. Some could channel water, place latrines carefully, and manage drainage more effectively than ordinary households. But even these places depended on labor and environment. Their systems remind us that medieval people were capable of planning. The issue in towns was not an absence of intelligence. It was the difficulty of applying planned solutions across crowded, mixed, unequal, growing spaces. Growth made everything harder. A small settlement could absorb waste differently from a busy commercial town. As populations increased, as trade expanded, as houses crowded closer, as more animals and carts entered, older habits became less adequate. What worked when fewer people lived along a lane could fail when every frontage was occupied, every yard was smaller, and every market day brought more traffic. Medieval filth was often a symptom of urban success. A prosperous town attracted people, goods, animals, and trades. Then it struggled to manage the consequences of that prosperity. This is another reversal worth holding on to. Dirt was not always a sign of decline. Sometimes it was the smell of activity. A silent, empty town might be cleaner in one sense, but it was also poorer, weaker, or abandoned. A crowded, muddy, noisy, smelly market street could be economically alive. The same conditions that offended the senses might indicate work, exchange, and survival. For the people living there, the choice was not between a modern clean city and a medieval dirty one. It was often between a working dirty town and no livelihood at all. That does not mean people accepted everything calmly. They could be angry, disgusted, and litigious. Neighbors could quarrel over drains, animals, boundaries, and dumping. Officials could impose penalties. Guilds could be warned. Landlords could be pressured. Complaints reveal that medieval people had standards. But their standards were shaped by proximity to necessity. They objected most strongly when dirt crossed a line. When it blocked, endangered, dishonored, contaminated, or imposed too heavily on someone who had the power to respond. The phrase "nobody complained" therefore hides the more interesting question. Whose complaints mattered? A wealthy citizen's discomfort might reach officials quickly. A poorer resident's complaint might vanish into routine. A market obstruction might be addressed faster than a foul alley. A nuisance near an important church or civic building might draw attention, while the same nuisance in a marginal lane lingered. Medieval cleanliness was not only technical. It was social power made visible in mud. And power could also decide where dirty work was located. Certain trades were pushed toward edges, waterways, or specific districts not simply because people were ignorant of their unpleasantness, but because everyone knew they were unpleasant. The town needed leather, meat, cloth, and metalwork, but not every resident wanted to live beside the processes that produced them. Over time, custom and regulation could cluster noisier or smellier work in particular areas. This was an early form of urban zoning, though less systematic than modern planning. The irony is that moving a foul trade away from one street did not make it disappear. It concentrated the burden somewhere else. The people who worked in those trades still breathed the air, handled the materials, and walked through the waste. The neighbors nearby still lived with it. The river still carried traces. The town as a whole still depended on the product. A clean leather belt, a warm woolen cloak, a sharp knife, a candlelit room, a roast meal, or a repaired shoe could all carry behind them some hidden discomfort. Medieval streets make that hidden discomfort visible. They remind us that material life has consequences. Every object has a making. Every meal has remains. Every animal has needs. Every household produces waste. Modern life separates these stages so effectively that consumption can feel clean. Medieval life placed them near one another. The butcher, the cook, the cart, the dung heap, the gutter, the market stall, and the dinner table were all part of one continuous chain. For a listener today, it can be tempting to reduce this world to smell alone. But the medieval street was also a soundscape and a texture. Wheels struck stones. Hooves splashed through mud. Sellers called out goods. Bells rang from churches. Dogs barked. Craftsmen hammered, scraped, stirred, cut, and carried. Doors opened directly onto life. People negotiated space with animals, neighbors, customers, officials, and strangers. Filth was one layer in a dense environment of movement. That density meant that street cleaning was never merely about removing dirt. It was about preserving circulation. If waste blocked a lane, the town's circulation slowed. If a gutter failed, water pooled. If animals wandered unchecked, market order weakened. If heaps were left too long, smell and resentment grew. A town was a living body in the medieval imagination more than a machine, and its streets were the channels through which its daily energy moved. Block those channels and the whole body suffered. This helps explain why town governments gradually became more involved in regulating streets. As towns grew wealthier and more complex, the need for shared rules increased. Local obligations still mattered, but broader coordination became necessary. Someone had to decide when paving should be repaired, where refuse could be taken, which trades were causing nuisances, how markets should be cleared, and who would be fined for neglect. The medieval town was not modern bureaucracy, but neither was it chaos. It was an evolving negotiation between custom, law, money, and habit. Often, that negotiation was reactive. A problem became unbearable, then a rule was made. A rule failed, then it was repeated. A street became impassable, then people were ordered to clear it. A drain clogged, then someone was fined. This reactive pattern made sense in a world where resources were limited and where permanent solutions were difficult. But it also meant towns were always slightly behind their own mess. There is a quiet rhythm in that. Use, dirt, complaint, cleaning, use again. It was not dramatic enough to appear in chronicles beside wars or dynastic marriages. But for the people who lived it, it shaped the day more directly than the names of distant rulers. A person might know the state of a lane, the smell near a corner, the safest stepping place after rain, the neighbor who dumped too much, the official who enforced rules, the hour when carts passed, and the route to avoid when animals were being driven through. This was practical knowledge learned by walking. Children learned it early. They would have known which puddles to avoid, which alleys smelled worst, which animals might kick or bite, which doorways were busy, which market scraps could be gathered, and which adults would shout if they got too close. A medieval child's map of a town was not drawn with clean lines. It was built from surfaces, smells, sounds, warnings, and habits. The street was a school of movement. For newcomers, the town could be disorienting. A rural visitor entering on market day might find the crowd, noise, smell, and traffic overwhelming, even if country life had its own dirt and animals. A pilgrim, trader, apprentice, servant, or migrant had to learn the town's patterns quickly. Which gates were busiest, which wells were reliable, which lanes flooded, which trades occupied which streets, where waste was taken, where to stand, where not to stand, when to move aside. And this brings us toward one of the most important forces behind medieval street filth: the relationship between town and countryside. The town depended on the countryside for food, fuel, animals, raw materials, and labor. The countryside depended on the town for markets, tools, money, legal business, and opportunities. Every market day brought rural matter into urban space. Carts with mud on their wheels, livestock from roads and fields, straw, hay, vegetables, firewood, hides, wool, grain, and people carrying the smells and dirt of travel. The town's filth was not sealed within its walls. It was part of a wider landscape moving through the gates. Those gates were thresholds of their own. Outside them lay roads that could be deeply muddy, rutted, and difficult, especially in wet seasons. A cart entering town did not become clean because it crossed a boundary. It brought the road with it. Hooves carried soil. Wheels carried muck. Animals carried their own waste. Goods carried straw, dust, chaff, and damp. The street inside the gate became a meeting place between rural dirt and urban waste. So the medieval street was not simply dirty from what townspeople did inside the town. It was dirted by exchange itself. Every delivery left traces. Every trade route deposited matter. Every animal brought both value and mess. A town that wanted prosperity had to open itself to movement, and movement was never clean. By the later medieval period, as some towns became more ambitious, wealthier, and more conscious of civic identity, the effort to manage this movement became more serious. Authorities could demand better paving on important routes, regulate carts, inspect nuisances, or organize the removal of waste more formally. But each improvement revealed the next weakness. A paved road needed drainage. A cleared market needed rules for the next market. A restricted dumping place needed enforcement. A raker needed wages. A gutter needed neighbors to respect it. A town wall controlled entry, but not the mud entering on every wheel. And all the while, beneath the ordinary dirt of daily life, there was a deeper anxiety slowly growing in the medieval urban mind. The fear that filth was not only offensive, not only inconvenient, not only dishonorable, but dangerous in ways people could sense even before they could scientifically explain. Bad air, corrupted water, rotting matter, crowded houses, and foul streets all seemed connected to sickness, even if the connection was understood through the language of the time. To understand why medieval streets mattered so much, we have to follow that anxiety next, into the uneasy space where smell, health, fear, and urban survival began to overlap. That overlap between smell, health, fear, and urban survival is one of the most revealing parts of the medieval street, because it shows us that people did not need microscopes to sense that something in the air of a crowded town could be wrong. They did not speak in the language of bacteria or viruses. They did not understand infection in the way a modern doctor would. But they lived close enough to rot, dampness, bad water, stagnant gutters, overcrowded rooms, and sudden outbreaks of illness to recognize patterns of danger. A foul smell was not merely unpleasant. It could feel like a warning. In medieval medical thought, air mattered deeply. The quality of the air around a person was believed to affect the balance of the body. Corrupted air, heavy vapors, and foul odors were often associated with disease, weakness, and misfortune. This way of thinking could lead to mistaken explanations, but it also encouraged people to pay attention to places where decay, crowding, and stagnant matter gathered. A blocked ditch, a heap of refuse, a dead animal left too long, a foul watercourse, or a street that trapped dampness and smell might be seen as dangerous because it polluted the air itself. That belief shaped urban behavior in practical ways. People wanted offensive smells removed not only because they were embarrassing, but because they were thought to have force. Smell was evidence. It reached the body before reason could examine it. It entered homes, shops, churches, and markets. It clung to clothing and hair. It made people uneasy because, in the medieval imagination, bad air could travel invisibly from a foul place into a vulnerable body. Even when the science was incomplete, the instinct that filth and sickness were connected was not foolish. This is why the street could become a medical concern without becoming a modern public health project. A town might order waste to be removed because it offended the nose, harmed trade, blocked passage, or threatened the purity of air. These motives were often mixed together. No single category explains them neatly. Health, morality, reputation, economy, and sensory discomfort all overlapped. A foul lane could be at once a nuisance, a danger, a shame, and a sign that someone had failed in civic duty. The fear became sharper during times of epidemic. When sickness spread through a town, ordinary dirt took on a different meaning. The same gutter that people tolerated in quieter times might seem more ominous. The same crowded market might feel less like prosperity and more like exposure. The same narrow streets that made neighborhood life intense could also make fear move quickly from door to door. In moments of crisis, people looked for causes in the air, in the stars, in divine judgment, in strangers, in moral failure, in corrupted matter, and in the visible disorder of their surroundings. The Black Death in the 14th century made these anxieties especially powerful, though it did not create them from nothing. Medieval towns already knew that disease could be devastating. They had seen fevers, childhood illnesses, infections, and seasonal sicknesses. But the plague scale forced communities to think more urgently about movement, contact, burial, smell, and urban order. Later regulations in many places became more attentive to cleanliness, not because medieval people suddenly became modern, but because repeated crises made the management of urban space feel more serious. Still, we should be careful not to imagine a simple line from dirty streets to plague. The plague was not caused merely by muddy lanes or bad smells. Its transmission was more complex than medieval observers could know. But the fear it produced strengthened the belief that foul environments mattered. If sickness seemed to arrive through invisible corruption, then visible filth became a target for control. A town might not be able to stop death, but it could clear a ditch, move a dung heap, regulate burial, burn aromatic substances, clean a market, or order offensive matter removed. These acts gave people some sense of agency in a frightening world. Agency mattered. In a society where medical treatments were limited and explanations were uncertain, action itself had emotional value. Sweeping, airing, burning herbs, avoiding foul places, cleaning wells, moving refuse, and regulating trades could all feel like ways to defend the community. Some actions were more effective than others. Some were symbolic. Some were practical. But together they show us that medieval people did not simply surrender to dirt. They interpreted it, negotiated with it, feared it, used it, and tried to push it back when it seemed to cross a dangerous line. One of the most important places where this fear gathered was water. Air carried smell, but water carried life. A town needed water for drinking, brewing, cooking, washing, animals, crafts, and fire control. Wells, streams, rivers, conduits, and fountains were among the most valuable points in the urban landscape. When clean water was scarce or difficult to reach, the entire rhythm of domestic labor changed. A household close to a reliable source had an advantage. A household that depended on a distant or crowded point spent more time and energy simply obtaining what modern people receive without thought. Because water was so essential, contamination could provoke concern. Town authorities might forbid certain activities near wells or conduits. They might restrict washing, dumping, or animal access in sensitive places. People understood that water could become foul. They could taste it, smell it, and see when it changed. They might not identify microorganisms, but they did not need modern instruments to know that a well polluted by waste, dead matter, or industrial residue was a problem. Yet towns repeatedly placed water under pressure. Rivers attracted trades that needed large amounts of water or wanted easy disposal. Butchers, dyers, fullers, tanners, brewers, and households all made claims on the same flowing resource. Upstream and downstream interests collided. A person washing cloth might affect someone drawing water. A trade that brought employment might foul the riverbank. A watercourse could be at once useful, dirty, defended, abused, and fought over. This is one of the reasons medieval urban cleanliness cannot be understood as a simple matter of ignorance. The difficulty was structural. The town needed the very things that polluted it. It needed animals, fire, craft production, markets, rivers, human labor, and dense settlement. Each of these supported life. Each also created waste. To remove all filth would have meant reorganizing the entire material basis of the town, and no medieval authority had the technology, money, or administrative reach to do that completely. So instead, towns managed boundaries. They asked where a thing belonged. Where should hides be treated? Where should butchers work? Where should dung be heaped? Where should carts unload? Where should fish be sold? Where should waste be taken? Where should pigs be allowed? Where should water be drawn? Where should washing occur? These questions sound humble, but they are the foundation of urban governance. A city becomes governable when it begins deciding where things may and may not happen. The medieval street was therefore not only a messy space. It was a map of decisions, compromises, failures, and priorities. A cleaner main street might show commercial importance. A neglected alley might show low status. A paved market might show investment. A foul ditch might show poverty, weak enforcement, or an unresolved conflict between neighbors. Every surface carried information. The body read that information constantly. Medieval people moved through town with a sensory intelligence that modern people often underestimate. They knew which streets were difficult after rain. They knew which gutters overflowed. They knew where animals were driven. They knew which corners smelled of particular trades. They knew which wells were favored, which lanes were crowded, which paths were safer in darkness, and which places to avoid in certain seasons. Their knowledge was not abstract. It was physical, local, repeated, and practical. This local knowledge shaped social life. A respectable household tried to manage its frontage. A successful merchant wanted customers to approach without too much obstruction. A guild wanted its reputation protected. A parish wanted processions to pass with dignity. A town council wanted streets usable enough for trade, taxation, and order. Cleanliness in this world was tied to trust. If a street was permanently blocked or foul, it suggested that obligations were not being met. But obligations could be contested. Suppose a gutter ran along several houses. One resident cleared his portion. Another allowed refuse to gather. Water slowed, pooled, and began to stink. Whose fault was the nuisance? The person who dumped waste? The person who failed to sweep? The landlord who neglected repair? The official who ignored complaints? The town that lacked funds? The answer could depend on custom, court, wealth, reputation, and the persistence of the complainant. Dirt created legal questions because dirt crossed boundaries. This is an easy thing to miss. Filth is mobile. It does not respect property lines. Smoke drifts. Smell spreads. Water runs downhill. Animals wander. Mud is carried on feet. Waste moved from one person's convenience into another person's discomfort. Medieval streets made interdependence impossible to ignore. A neighbor's habits entered your doorway. A trade's byproducts entered your air. A block drain near one house could affect the whole lane. Because of that, complaints about filth were also complaints about community. They asked whether people were living properly among one another. A dirty street could become a sign that the social order was fraying, that households were neglecting duties, that officials were weak, or that economic activity had outgrown old arrangements. The mud underfoot was material, but it was also political. And yet, much of the work remained ordinary and quiet. Imagine a morning after rain. The market has not fully awakened. The lane is dull with wetness. A raker or servant moves slowly along the street, pushing soaked straw, dung, and scraps into a rough pile. The work is heavy because wet waste resists movement. A cart may come later if one is available. Nearby, a shopkeeper clears the threshold before opening shutters. Someone throws sand or straw over the worst patch. A dog noses near discarded food until it is chased away. A child watches from a doorway. Bells begin to sound. The town resumes before the street is clean. That last detail matters. The town rarely waited for cleanliness. Life began around it. Work did not pause until the ideal condition appeared. People stepped over, around, and through what could not be immediately removed. This produced a different relationship with discomfort. Medieval people were not comfortable in the modern sense, but they were practiced at functioning amid inconvenience. They lived with a higher tolerance for sensory difficulty because the alternative was often impossible. That tolerance was not the same as approval. It was adaptation. Adaptation can be mistaken for indifference. When people stop reacting visibly to a bad smell, it does not always mean they think the smell is pleasant. It may mean they have work to do. It may mean complaint is useless. It may mean the source of the smell is also the source of their income. It may mean everyone knows the problem and no one has the money to fix it. It may mean that in a world of many hardships, this one has been folded into the background of daily life. For medieval townspeople, the street's filth competed with hunger, debt, illness, weather, rent, taxes, labor demands, family responsibilities, and spiritual concerns. A muddy road might be annoying, but a failed harvest was worse. A foul gutter might be offensive, but losing work could be devastating. This does not make dirt unimportant. It places dirt within a hierarchy of survival. People cared, but care had to be rationed. Season changed that hierarchy. In winter, cold could harden mud and waste, reducing some smells while creating treacherous footing. Snow, where it fell, could briefly cover the street, making the town appear cleaner than it was. Then thaw revealed what had been hidden. In spring, rain and melting brought movement, runoff, and renewed odor. In summer, heat could intensify smell, attract insects, and make decay more noticeable. Autumn markets and animal movements could bring their own burdens. The medieval street was never one thing. It changed with weather, trade cycles, agricultural rhythms, and feast days. Feast days themselves could transform urban space. Streets might be cleared, decorated, and filled with processions, banners, music, and ritual. For a few hours, a lane that usually belonged to carts, animals, and waste might become a ceremonial route. But even ceremony rested on practical cleaning. Someone had to remove obstructions. Someone had to prepare the way. The beauty of public religion and civic identity passed over surfaces that, the day before, might have been muddy and foul. The sacred and the filthy were closer than modern imagination likes to admit. That closeness did not necessarily feel contradictory to medieval people. Their world was full of mixtures. Holy relics in crowded churches, prayer beside market noise, noble processions through streets recently cleared of dung, beautiful cloth produced by smelly labor, fine leather from foul tanning, bread sold near mud and animals, law proclaimed in spaces that still needed sweeping. The medieval town did not divide purity and practicality as sharply as we do. It tried to create moments of order within a material world that constantly pushed back. This push and pull can be seen in the language of nuisance. Medieval legal and civic records often focus on things that disturb, obstruct, offend, or endanger. A nuisance might not be filth in general, but filth in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong quantity, affecting the wrong person. This is a subtle but important distinction. Waste tolerated in a yard might be intolerable in a street. Smell tolerated near a trade district might be unacceptable near a church or wealthy frontage. Mud after rain might be expected. A blocked drain left uncleared might be punishable. The moral geography of the town was therefore uneven. Some places were allowed to be dirtier because their function demanded it or because the people nearby had less power. Other places were expected to be cleaner because they symbolized authority, trade, religion, or status. Modern cities still work this way in many forms. The clean square and the neglected back lane are not opposites. They are often parts of the same system. If we stand in a medieval street long enough, the question changes. We stop asking only, "Why was it so dirty?" and begin asking, "Why was any of it clean at all?" Given the number of animals, fires, trades, households, markets, carts, and bodies passing through a town each day, the survival of any regular order is striking. The fact that streets remained passable, markets functioned, water was protected in some places, and rules were repeatedly issued shows not apathy, but effort under constraint. This effort was fragile because it depended on people doing unpleasant things again and again. A drain cleared today might be blocked tomorrow. A heap removed in the morning might be replaced by evening. Paving repaired in one season might be damaged by winter. A rule obeyed during inspection might be ignored afterward. Medieval urban order was not a finished structure. It was maintenance. Maintenance is rarely glamorous, which is why history often overlooks it. Chronicles prefer kings, battles, treaties, and miracles. But the everyday life of a town depended on maintenance more than spectacle. The person clearing a gutter did not change the dynasty, but they changed whether a neighbor could reach the market dry-footed. The official fining a careless dumper did not make epic history, but he helped define what public responsibility meant. The servant carrying foul water away from a house did not appear in noble records, but without that work, domestic life would quickly sour. The hidden labor of cleanliness also tells us something about gender and status. Many domestic cleaning tasks fell to women and servants, though street labor and carting could involve men in formal civic roles depending on the place and period. Women carried water, washed vessels, cleaned living spaces, tended hearths, managed food scraps, cared for children, and performed countless small acts that kept household disorder from spilling too far out of control. Their labor shaped the boundary between home and street. It was repetitive, expected, and often undervalued. In poor households, the same person might cook, clean, work, care for children, fetch water, manage fuel, and deal with waste with very little space or equipment. In wealthier households, servants performed much of this work under direction. Either way, cleanliness was not an abstract virtue. It was time, muscle, access, and tools. A broom, a bucket, a shovel, a cart, a vessel, a cloth, a drain, a pit, a yard, a servant, a rule. These were the small technologies of order. Even the humble broom deserves attention. Sweeping did not remove waste from the world. It relocated it. It pushed dust, straw, ash, scraps, and dirt from one surface to another. A swept interior could mean a dirtier threshold. A cleared threshold could mean a pile at the edge of the street. A cleared street could mean a dump beyond the wall. Cleaning was always an act of movement, and movement required decisions about where the unwanted should go. This is why the edge of the town mattered. Beyond the walls or outer lanes, there might be pits, middens, ditches, fields, riverbanks, or informal dumping places. Some waste could be reused. Some simply accumulated. The boundary between town and countryside was porous, but it was also convenient. What the town could not tolerate in its center might be pushed outward. The smell did not vanish. Changed audience. Town walls, where they existed, intensified the problem. Walls offered defense, identity, toll control, and prestige, but they could also confine growth. As more people and activities pressed inside, space became precious. Yards shrank. Buildings crowded. Streets narrowed under pressure. Waste that might have been spread more thinly in an open settlement became concentrated. The wall protected the town, but it also helped trap the consequences of urban density. Gates concentrated traffic even more. Animals, carts, travelers, merchants, pilgrims, officials, and beggars entered at the same points. Gateways could become muddy, crowded, noisy, and dirty. They were also places of regulation, taxation, and surveillance. A gate was not just an opening in a wall. It was a filter through which the outside world entered. And the outside world entered with mud on its wheels. Roads beyond the town were often difficult, especially after rain. Carts cut deep tracks. Animals churned soil. Travelers carried dirt on boots and hems. By the time goods reached the market, they had already gathered the landscape onto themselves. The medieval street absorbed not only urban waste but the traces of travel. A town connected to trade could not remain untouched by the roads that fed it. This connection between road, gate, market, and street helps explain why complete cleanliness was nearly impossible. A town was not a sealed room. It was a meeting point. Grain from fields, wool from sheep, hides from animals, fish from rivers or coasts, timber from woods, stone from quarries, iron from forges, and people from surrounding villages all moved through it. Every useful connection brought debris. Prosperity had texture. Some of that texture became part of memory. People remembered places by what they smelled like, what work happened there, what surfaces felt like underfoot, and what risks belonged to each route. A lane of fishmongers was not just an economic category. It was an experience. A street of metalworkers had sound as well as dirt. A tanning area had a reputation. A market square had different faces depending on hour and season. Urban identity was sensory. That sensory identity could also appear in names. Many medieval streets took names from trades, markets, landmarks, gates, churches, or features of daily use. A street name could preserve what was made there, sold there, smelled there, or endured there. Names made the working town legible. They also remind us that the modern romantic image of medieval streets as charming lanes misses their original force. These places were not designed as picturesque backgrounds. They were functional corridors of labor. The more we look, the more the filth becomes a clue rather than merely a spectacle. It points toward the town's economy, technology, law, class structure, medical beliefs, labor systems, and relationship with the countryside. A muddy lane tells us about paving costs. A foul gutter tells us about drainage and neighborly duty. Animal dung tells us about transport and food. Smoke tells us about fuel and heating. A polluted river tells us about production and disposal. A complaint tells us about expectations. A fine tells us about authority. A swept threshold tells us about pride. This is why a careful history of medieval streets must resist both exaggeration and sanitizing. The streets were often dirtier, smellier, and more physically uncomfortable than modern people would tolerate. But they were not meaningless chaos. They were managed imperfectly by people who had reasons for what they did and limits on what they could do. The real story lies in that tension. A society intelligent enough to recognize many problems, but not yet equipped to solve them on the scale required by urban growth. And urban growth did not slow simply because the streets were unpleasant. People kept coming. Apprentices sought work. Merchants followed opportunity. Peasants came to market. Servants entered households. Pilgrims passed through. Officials collected rents and tolls. Students gathered in university towns. Clergy served churches. Widows, migrants, beggars, craftsmen, and traders all occupied the urban world in different ways. The town promised danger and discomfort, but also possibility. Possibility has always drawn people into difficult places. A medieval town could be cramped, expensive, unhealthy, noisy, and foul, yet still offer wages, markets, protection, charity, legal privileges, apprenticeship, marriage prospects, and access to goods unavailable in smaller villages. For many, the dirt was part of the price of opportunity. They did not choose filth for its own sake. They accepted it because the town offered something valuable enough to endure it. That value was visible on market days, when the same streets that smelled of animals and damp straw also filled with color, bargaining, and movement. Baskets of produce, bolts of cloth, metal tools, pottery, bread, fish, poultry, herbs, and second-hand goods turned the filthy street into a place of abundance. The contradiction is striking. The ground might be foul, but the stalls could be full. The air might be smoky, but the town might feel alive with exchange. Dirt and vitality were not opposites. In the medieval city, they often arrived together. As afternoon moved toward evening, the market would thin. Sellers packed what remained. Animals were led away. Scraps lay underfoot. The gutters carried what water they could. Street officials, servants, or local residents might clear the most urgent mess, especially in important spaces. But much remained. The town did not reset to cleanliness when commerce ended. It settled into a quieter form of disorder, waiting for night, for rain, for scavengers, for morning labor, and for the next wave of use. Night changed the meaning of every nuisance. Smell remained, but sight weakened. A pile that could be stepped around by day became a hazard in darkness. A gutter was easier to misjudge. Mud, stones, animals, and refuse merged into shadow. Those who moved through the streets after dark did so with caution, memory, and sometimes light. The medieval town at night was not empty, but it was less forgiving. The same street that had been an economic artery by day became a place where the body had to remember what the eye could not see. And in that darkness, the fears of health, smell, disorder, and danger blended with another concern that shaped medieval street life just as strongly as sanitation: safety. A filthy street could be unpleasant, but a dark, narrow, badly kept street could also be threatening. Poor surfaces, hidden corners, wandering animals, drunkenness, thieves, fire risks, and sudden quarrels all belonged to the nighttime city. To understand why medieval authorities cared about streets, we have to follow the story beyond waste itself, into the way dirty, crowded lanes became questions of order, policing, and control after the sun went down. That concern with order, policing, and control after the sun went down gives the medieval street another layer of meaning. By daylight, a muddy lane was a nuisance, a workplace, a market route, a neighborly problem, and a sign of the town's material limits. By night, the same lane could become uncertain territory. The dirt did not disappear. It became harder to read. The gutter was still there, but less visible. The dung heap, loose stone, broken paving, discarded scraps, and wandering animal were still present, but they blended into darkness. In a town where artificial light was weak and expensive, disorder did not need to be dramatic to become dangerous. It only needed to be difficult to see. This is why the cleanliness of streets and the safety of streets were never completely separate. A blocked passage could slow a person fleeing trouble. A heap of refuse could hide a hazard. A dark corner near a foul ditch could become a place people avoided. A narrow lane filled with mud, animals, and obstructions gave less room to move, less room to turn a cart, and less room to avoid confrontation. Poor maintenance was not simply ugly. It could weaken the town's ability to govern itself. Medieval authorities understood streets as spaces that needed watching. Not in the modern sense of electric lamps, cameras, police radios, and uniformed patrols, but through a patchwork of curfews, night watches, gates, ward systems, household obligations, civic officers, and the knowledge of neighbors. A town was safest when people could be identified, movement could be explained, and streets remained passable enough for response. Darkness worked against all three. In many towns, the ringing of bells helped mark the movement from day into night. Bells did not only call people to worship. They regulated time, labor, markets, danger, and discipline. A curfew bell might signal that fires should be covered, movement limited, taverns watched, gates closed, and respectable people expected to withdraw indoors. The word curfew itself carries the older idea of covering fire, a reminder that night danger was not only social but physical. A town built from timber, thatch, stored fuel, open flames, workshops, and crowded housing lived with the constant fear of fire. That fear connected directly to dirty streets. Straw, rushes, scraps of wood, dry refuse, loose thatch, and accumulated debris could feed flame if conditions were right. A street too cluttered with carts, stalls, heaps, and animals could slow response. Water had to be reached and carried. neighbors had to wake. Ladders, hooks, buckets, and hands had to appear quickly. In a tightly built town, fire could move faster than authority. Cleanliness, clearance, and order were therefore part of fire prevention, even when people did not speak of them in modern technical terms. At night, the town's surfaces became part of its vulnerability. Imagine a late evening lane after a damp day. The market has closed. The household shutters are drawn. Smoke thins above the roofs. Somewhere a tavern door opens, and a spill of weak light falls briefly onto the mud before vanishing again. A person walking home knows the street by memory more than sight. He knows where the stones rise, where water gathers, where the gutter cuts across the path, where dogs sleep, where a neighbor's refuse heap leans too far into the way. Each step is a small act of trust in habit. But habit was not enough for everyone. Visitors, servants newly arrived, apprentices, pilgrims, travelers, and the very poor could be less familiar with the safest routes. A town that felt legible to longtime residents could confuse outsiders. The same narrow streets that supported community also made strangers noticeable and sometimes suspicious. After dark, a person without a clear reason to be moving might attract attention. In a society where identity was often local and reputation mattered, the street at night asked a silent question. Who are you, and why are you here? This question shaped policing. Medieval policing was not usually a centralized professional force as we imagine today. It was communal, uneven, and deeply tied to local responsibility. Watches might be organized by wards or neighborhoods. Citizens could be expected to take turns guarding gates or patrolling streets. Constables, beadles, sergeants, or other officers might enforce rules depending on the town and period. The system was imperfect, but it reveals something important. The medieval street was not left entirely to chance. It was watched because it mattered. What did watchers look for? Not only thieves or violence. They looked for disorder in many forms. People out after curfew, suspicious strangers, taverns operating beyond allowed hours, fires left dangerously, quarrels, blocked routes, wandering animals, breaches of market rules, and sometimes the very nuisances that made streets difficult to use. A dirty, obstructed, badly governed street was easier to associate with other failures of order. Filth was not identical with crime, but both belonged to the broader question of whether the community was being kept in proper shape. The link between cleanliness and morality could be subtle but powerful. A well-kept frontage suggested discipline, reputation, and respect for neighbors. A neglected space could suggest poverty, disorder, or defiance. Authorities often treated the physical condition of streets as part of civic virtue. A town that could present clean routes for processions, safe passages for trade, and controlled streets after dark was not merely more comfortable. It appeared more honorable and better governed. Yet the same town might struggle to enforce those ideals in its poorer corners. Darkness, dirt, and poverty could reinforce one another. A poorly maintained lane was less likely to be well lit, less likely to attract swift official attention, and more likely to carry a reputation for danger. Residents there were not necessarily more disorderly by nature. They were often living with weaker infrastructure and less influence. The medieval city, like many cities after it, distributed safety unevenly. This unevenness mattered at the gates as well. Town gates were points of protection, taxation, identity, and control. Closing them at night could help regulate movement, but gates did not seal away every problem. People still moved within the walls. Animals still needed tending. Fires still burned. Taverns still drew customers. Servants still carried out tasks. The poor still searched for shelter or opportunity. And waste still waited in the streets, no cleaner because the gates were shut. For those whose work happened early or late, darkness was not optional. Bakers might begin before dawn. brewers, carriers, servants, market sellers, and travelers could move at hours when others slept. The town's night was not an empty pause, but a thinner, more cautious version of its day. The smell of warm bread might mix with damp gutters. The sound of a cartwheel might appear before sunrise. A servant with a bucket might cross a lane before the market opened. Urban life never completely stopped. It shifted into quieter forms. Taverns and alehouses added another dimension. They were social spaces, economic spaces, and, to authorities, sometimes troublesome spaces. Drink itself was not outside ordinary life. Ale was central to diet and hospitality. But places where people gathered after dark could produce noise, quarrels, spilled drink, broken vessels, and late movement through already difficult streets. A muddy, narrow lane outside a crowded drinking place could become a stage for conflict, especially when visibility was poor and tempers had warmed. This does not mean medieval towns were in constant nighttime chaos. Many nights were probably ordinary. People sleeping, fires banked, animals settled, watchmen moving, church bells marking time, and the town breathing in the dark. But the potential for disorder was enough to shape rules. Curfews, watches, and fire regulations existed because the risks were real. A well-ordered town had to manage not only dirt underfoot, but behavior in space. The street's physical condition affected that management. A clear street was easier to patrol. A passable lane allowed watchmen, neighbors, or officials to respond. A blocked or foul route discouraged movement by respectable residents and created pockets of avoidance. When people avoid a space, oversight weakens. When oversight weakens, reputation changes. A dirty lane can become not only a place of waste, but a place where authority feels thinner. This is one reason civic authorities paid attention to obstructions. Stalls, timber, barrels, carts, dung heaps, building materials, and refuse could all narrow the already narrow. Even if they were not filthy in themselves, they made the street harder to govern. Medieval streets were often economically crowded because space was valuable. Shopkeepers wanted to display goods. Builders needed materials. Householders needed places for storage. Animals needed standing room. But every private use of public space made passage more difficult. Regulation of street clutter was therefore a negotiation between livelihood and order. Overhanging upper stories added to this sense of compression. In many towns, buildings leaned toward one another, and projecting floors could make streets feel enclosed. This was not always a sign of careless construction. Urban land was valuable, and building upward and outward made practical sense. But the result below could be dimmer, narrower, and less airy. Light reached the ground less easily. Smoke and smell could linger. Rain might fall unevenly from roofs. The street became a corridor not only between houses, but beneath them. Drainage suffered in such spaces. If the sun rarely dried a lane fully, dampness persisted. Damp straw, mud, and waste produced more smell. In cold months, wet surfaces chilled the feet. In warm months, stagnant dampness could feel oppressive. Narrowness magnified everything. Sound, smell, proximity, conflict, and the sense that one person's habits pressed directly into another person's life. When officials tried to regulate streets, they were therefore regulating a living pressure system. It was not enough to say, "Keep the streets clean." The town had to ask what that meant in a lane where 5 households, 2 shops, a stable, a passing cart, a gutter, and a market crowd all competed for space. The law could declare an ideal. The street answered with reality. That reality was shaped by building work. Medieval towns were constantly being repaired, expanded, damaged, and rebuilt. Timber rotted, roofs leaked, walls leaned, paving loosened, Fires destroyed rows of houses. Storms damaged structures. Wars, riots, and accidents left marks. Building materials often sat in streets because there was nowhere else to put them. Lime, timber, stone, clay, tiles, and rubble could obstruct movement. Construction created dust, fragments, and temporary hazards. Improvement itself made mess before it created order. This is another small reversal. Some street filth was the byproduct of trying to make the town better. Repairing paving could create piles of stone and earth. Building stronger houses could block lanes with timber. Digging drainage could leave mud and spoil. Clearing one nuisance might create another for a time. Medieval urban management was rarely clean, even when its purpose was cleanliness. The same pattern applied to water systems. If a conduit was repaired, if a ditch was cleared, if a channel was dug, the work disrupted the street. People had to tolerate temporary difficulty in the hope of longer-term function. But because resources were limited, temporary could become prolonged. A half-cleared ditch, a delayed repair, or a poorly maintained drain could stand as evidence that the town's ambitions outran its capacity. Capacity depended heavily on money. Civic cleanliness required revenue. Paving, carts, wages, tools, enforcement, and repairs all cost something. Towns raised funds through tolls, market fees, fines, rents, guild contributions, and other mechanisms, but money had many demands on it. Walls, bridges, churches, defenses, ceremonies, legal costs, poor relief, and political obligations. Street cleaning competed with everything else. When budgets tightened, maintenance suffered. This makes medieval filth partly a financial history. A wealthy town could do more, but even wealth had limits. A poor town might know what needed to be done and still lack the means. Residents might resist paying for improvements they felt benefited others more than themselves. Landlords might avoid repair. Tenants might lack authority to fix structural problems. Civic officers might impose fines, but fines themselves could be resented or unevenly collected. Clean streets required not only knowledge, but a workable system of payment. And payment raised questions of benefit. Should a whole town pay for a street used mainly by certain merchants? Should householders pay only for the frontage before their doors? Should a trade that creates special filth pay more? Should market fees fund cleaning after market day? These questions are not modern inventions. They belong to the long history of urban life. Waste is always political because removal has a cost. Sometimes the cost was shifted into obligation rather than cash. Residents might be required to perform labor, provide materials, or maintain their frontage. This could seem fair in a small community where everyone saw the need. But in a larger town, obligations became uneven. A widow, a poor laborer, or a struggling tenant might find the same duty more burdensome than a prosperous merchant. Rules that looked equal on parchment could feel unequal in practice. This tension helps explain why enforcement could be both necessary and unpopular. A town without enforcement slid toward obstruction and nuisance. A town with enforcement risked anger, accusations of unfairness, and conflict over who was being targeted. Officials dealing with streets were not merely cleaning, they were mediating social strain. The mud in the gutter carried arguments about money, labor, status, and civic belonging. The watchman at night, the raker in the morning, the market official at noon, and the householder at the threshold were all part of the same fragile arrangement. Each guarded a different aspect of urban order. One watched behavior, one moved waste, one protected trade, one defended household reputation. None could solve the town alone. Medieval urban life depended on overlapping duties, and when those duties failed, the failure became visible in the street. There is a calm but striking truth here. Medieval streets were not filthy because they were outside society's concern. They were filthy because they were at the very center of society's most difficult negotiations. Everyone needed them, everyone used them, everyone affected them, yet no one controlled them completely. They were shared spaces before modern infrastructure, and shared spaces reveal the limits of cooperation more honestly than private rooms do. The town's authorities also had to think about animals after dark. Pigs, dogs, horses, and other animals could create hazards if uncontrolled. Pigs especially appear often in urban regulations because they were useful scavengers but troublesome residents. They consumed scraps which could help reduce some waste, but they also rooted, wandered, fouled streets, damaged property, and frightened or injured people. To ban them completely could hurt households that relied on them. To allow them freely could anger neighbors. Again, the medieval solution was often regulation, not elimination. Dogs added their own complications. They guarded, followed, scavenged, and sometimes threatened. At night, barking could signal movement or disturbance, could also add to anxiety. A dark lane with loose dogs, refuse underfoot, and poor light was not simply dirty. It was uncertain. People navigated it with ears as much as eyes. Horses and carts had to be managed too. The movement of goods could not stop, but heavy traffic damaged streets. Wheels carved ruts, hooves loosened surfaces, loads spilled, narrow lanes made passing difficult. A cart stuck in mud could block a route, create anger, and leave the street worse than before. Street maintenance and transport were locked together. The town needed carts to supply itself, but carts helped destroy the surfaces they required. This relationship between transport and filth is easy to overlook because modern roads are engineered to absorb traffic at a scale medieval towns could not imagine. In a medieval town, every heavy cart was an event on the surface. If a street was poorly paved or waterlogged, traffic could rapidly degrade it. Mud did not simply lie there. It was manufactured by movement, pressed into existence by wheels, hooves, and feet. In dry weather, that same surface might produce dust. Dust carried its own discomfort, could settle on goods, food, clothing, and faces. It mixed with ash, powdered dung, and soil. A street that was muddy in one season could be dusty in another, and neither condition matched the modern idea of cleanliness. The medieval street was always transforming, and people adapted their clothing, routes, and habits accordingly. Clothing tells us much about this adaptation. Hems could be lifted. Shoes or pattens could help raise the foot above mud. Wealthier people might have better footwear, servants, or horses. Poorer people endured more direct contact with the street. The condition of the road could mark the body. Mud on shoes, stains on garments, smells in cloth, and dampness at the hem were not incidental. They were part of moving through the town. For women, long garments could make muddy streets especially troublesome, though clothing varied by class, region, and period. For workers carrying goods, waste, water, or tools, the street's surface affected balance and fatigue. For older people or the injured, uneven footing could be dangerous. For children, the street could be both playground and hazard. A filthy lane was not just visually unpleasant. It shaped posture, movement, risk, and the daily use of the body. This is where the history becomes quietly intimate. Medieval street filth did not remain outside people. It touched feet, hems, hands, tools, wheels, animal legs, doorways, market baskets, and household floors. Dirt moved inward. Even if a family tried to keep the interior swept and ordered, the street followed people inside. A threshold could slow the dirt but not stop it. The town entered the house on shoes, clothing, goods, and air. Households responded with routines. Floors might be swept. Rushes or straw might be laid down and replaced. Vessels washed. Tools wiped. Clothing brushed, aired, or laundered when possible. But these routines again required labor. The more the street dirted people, the more domestic work increased. Urban filth was not only a public problem. It became private labor, often performed quietly by those with the least public recognition. The boundary between street and house was especially porous in shops. Many businesses opened directly onto the road. Goods came in and out. Customers stood near thresholds. Work might be visible from outside. A craftsman's reputation depended partly on accessibility, but accessibility brought dirt. Dust, mud, smoke, and smell could enter the workspace. Keeping goods presentable was another form of maintenance. A shopkeeper did not need a spotless street. He needed a street clean enough for customers to approach and goods not to be spoiled. Some goods were more vulnerable than others. Cloth could absorb smell and dirt. Food could be contaminated or simply made unattractive. Metal, pottery, and wood were more durable but still affected by mud and handling. Market regulation often reflected these practical differences. Officials cared where food was sold, how meat and fish were handled, whether goods obstructed passage, and how remains were cleared. Cleanliness and commerce were joined at the stall. The reputation of a town could travel with merchants. A town known for disorder, impassable streets, foul markets, or unreliable conditions could suffer. Travelers carried impressions. So did officials and visitors of rank. Civic pride was not merely vanity. It was economic and political capital. When towns cleaned for ceremonies or important visits, they were managing reputation. The street was a public argument about the town's worth. But reputation could be staged. A cleaned procession route did not reveal the alley behind it. A market square cleared for inspection did not show the yard where waste had been pushed. A main street paved for trade did not erase the muddy margins. Medieval towns, like modern cities, had front stages and back stages. Filth often retreated into the spaces visitors were not meant to notice. Those hidden spaces mattered deeply. Back lanes, yards, middens, stables, work courts, and river edges absorbed the burden of the cleaner-looking front. They were the town's working underlayer. Servants moved through them. Animals stood in them. Waste accumulated in them. Trades used them. Children played near them. Poor residents lived closer to them. To understand the medieval street, we have to include not only the lanes everyone saw, but the service spaces that made public order possible. In some places, the distinction between street and yard was blurred. Houses might have small rear spaces, shared courts, access alleys, or outbuildings. Waste storage, animals, fuel, tools, and craft materials could be packed tightly around living space. If a yard was poorly drained, smell and dampness affected the household. If it was well managed, it reduced the burden on the public street. Domestic space was therefore part of the town's sanitation system, though no one would have described it that way. Where yards were absent or cramped, the street carried more pressure. Poorer residents in subdivided housing had fewer options. As populations grew and buildings were split among more households, waste management became harder. More people used the same frontage, the same yard, the same privy, the same water source, and the same lane. Density multiplied small problems until they became urban conditions. This brings us back to the question of why people did not complain more, or why their complaints did not transform the street. They did complain when pressure became too great. But complaint does not automatically produce infrastructure. A neighbor can be fined, a heap can be moved, a gutter can be cleared, yet the next day's economy produces more waste. The medieval town did not lack complaints. It lacked the capacity to convert complaint into permanent cleanliness. Permanent cleanliness required systems that later centuries would build only slowly. More extensive sewers, more regular waste collection, better paving, larger water supplies, stricter zoning, professional administration, stronger taxation, improved building regulations, and eventually new scientific understandings of disease. Medieval towns had pieces of this, but not the full structure. They managed, adjusted, and endured. Endurance should not be mistaken for passivity. It was active. It meant knowing when to sweep, when to complain, when to avoid a lane, when to lift a hem, when to cover a nose, when to draw water elsewhere, when to move waste before a fine came, when to tolerate a smell because the trade paid wages, and when to pressure officials because a nuisance had crossed the line. Medieval people lived with filth through 1,000 small decisions. Those decisions shaped the emotional atmosphere of the street. There was annoyance, certainly, disgust at times, fear during sickness, resentment toward negligent neighbors, pride in a well-kept frontage, relief when a drain finally cleared, familiarity with smells that would shock a visitor, humor, perhaps, in the ordinary absurdities of animals and mud. The medieval street was not one emotion. It was a daily negotiation between irritation and necessity. As we follow that negotiation further, one group becomes especially important: the trades whose work made streets not just generally dirty, but intensely offensive in specific ways. Butchers, tanners, fullers, fishmongers, dyers, brewers, and others did not merely add to urban filth. They reveal why towns tolerated certain kinds of foulness, because they were tied to essential goods, employment, and wealth. To understand the medieval street fully, we have to walk next toward the working districts, where the smell was stronger, the rules sharper, and the contradiction between prosperity and pollution became impossible to ignore. The working districts of a medieval town reveal the subject with unusual clarity, because they show us that urban filth was not always an accidental failure. Sometimes it was the visible cost of making the things people needed most. A town wanted meat, leather, woolen cloth, ale, candles, soap, dyed fabric, metal tools, and fish. It wanted markets full, workshops busy, and apprentices learning trades. But almost every useful craft left something behind: smoke, wastewater, scraps, skins, hair, ash, smell, sludge, and noise. The question was not whether the town could have prosperity without mess. The question was where the mess should go, who should endure it, and how much of it the community could tolerate before usefulness became nuisance. A butcher street is a good place to begin, because meat was valuable, familiar, and troublesome. Butchery had to be close enough to customers for trade to function. People needed access to fresh meat in a world without refrigeration as we know it. Animals had to be brought in, slaughtered, cut, sold, and the remaining matter dealt with quickly. The work could not be made delicate simply because the town wished to smell better. It involved bodies, tools, water, surfaces, carts, and time. If the remains were not moved, if gutters clogged, if dogs and pigs found what had been left, if summer heat intensified everything, then the butcher's necessary trade became a public offense. Butchers were often watched carefully for that reason. Their work sat at the boundary between nourishment and pollution. The same town that depended on them also distrusted the mess they made. Rules might govern where they worked, what they could throw away, how they used watercourses, or how quickly waste had to be removed. A butcher's stall could represent abundance at one hour and nuisance at the next. This contradiction was not hypocrisy. It was the ordinary tension of medieval life. Everyone wanted the product, but nobody wanted the byproducts near their own door. The problem became sharper because meat connected the countryside to the street. Animals entered town alive, carrying mud from roads and fields. They needed space, handling, and restraint. They could block passage, panic, damage goods, or leave waste in already crowded lanes. Once slaughtered and sold, the useful portions moved into kitchens, inns, and households, while the less wanted remains had to be carried away, sold for secondary uses, or discarded. The trade was not one clean transaction. It was a chain of movement, each stage leaving traces. fishmongers faced a different but equally stubborn problem. Fish spoiled quickly, and its smell could announce itself before the eye found the stall. In coastal towns, river towns, and larger markets supplied by fish trade, fish was important food, especially on days when religious practice restricted meat. Salted, dried, or fresh fish all had their place, but fresh fish required speed. It had to be brought, displayed, sold, cleaned, and consumed before decay made it worthless. The urgency of the trade meant scraps, water, scales, baskets, and odors gathered around it. A fish market could be lively, profitable, and offensive all at once. Again, the town did not solve the issue by deciding fish was unpleasant and therefore unnecessary. It managed the nuisance because the product mattered. The presence of foul smell did not mean the town had failed to distinguish good from bad. It meant the town had to live with the fact that good food could produce bad air. In medieval urban logic, the line between acceptable and unacceptable was rarely drawn at smell alone. It was drawn at excess, obstruction, contamination, and conflict. Tanning makes the contradiction even clearer. Leather was everywhere in medieval life. Belts, shoes, harnesses, bags, sheaths, straps, book bindings, buckets, protective garments, and countless small objects depended on worked animal hide. A town without leather would have struggled to function. But transforming hides into durable leather involved long, unpleasant processes, water, pits, scraping, soaking, and substances that produced strong odors. Tanners often required access to water and space, which pushed their work toward rivers, streams, edges, or specialized areas. Yet placing them by water created another problem. The very resource they needed could carry their waste onward. The medieval town therefore had to tolerate a trade that many residents would prefer to keep at a distance. Tanners were useful and often regulated. Their work could be clustered, restricted, or pushed toward less prestigious spaces. But it could not simply vanish. Every shoe walking over the muddy street depended, in some hidden way, on an earlier place that likely smelled much worse than the shoe itself. That is one of the quiet ironies of the medieval street. People used leather to survive the mud, and the making of leather helped foul the town's water and air. Fulling and dyeing reveal a similar pattern in the cloth trade. Woolen cloth was one of the great economic foundations of many medieval regions. It clothed bodies, supported merchants, employed households, filled markets, and connected towns to long-distance trade. But cloth did not become desirable simply by being woven. It often needed washing, thickening, finishing, dyeing, drying, stretching, and inspection. These processes used water, heat, labor, and materials that could be dirty, strong-smelling, or difficult to dispose of. The fullers who cleaned and thickened cloth performed work that was physically demanding and not always pleasant. Dyers worked with color, which sounds beautiful from a distance, but the actual process could involve vats, residues, and stained water. A finished piece of cloth might appear rich, orderly, and respectable in a merchant's shop, but its earlier life belonged to wet labor, strong substances, and waste. The town's visible prosperity often rested on invisible discomfort. This is a recurring theme in medieval urban life. Refinement had a dirty foundation. A clean belt, polished shoe, dyed cloak, roast meal, bright candle, and cup of ale could all emerge from processes that left residue in the street, yard, river, or air. The medieval street forces us to see the whole chain at once. It does not allow the product to float free from production. Candle makers and soap makers add another layer. Light and cleanliness themselves could produce mess. Candles made from tallow had their own smell, and the handling of fats and materials could be unpleasant. Soap making, though associated with washing, required work with substances that did not make the workshop feel fresh and gentle. The idea that cleanliness was born from clean processes is a modern illusion. In many pre-modern towns, the means of making something useful for hygiene, light, or comfort could be dirty, smoky, and offensive. Brewing was more familiar and often less repellent than tanning, but it also shaped streets. Ale and beer were central to daily life in many places, safer or more practical than water in some contexts, nourishing, social, and commercial. Brewing required grain, water, fuel, vessels, heat, storage, and transport. It produced spent grain, steam, smoke, and wastewater. A busy brewing household or commercial brewhouse contributed to the town's smell and traffic. But because drink was essential, brewing was not treated as optional noise. It was part of the town's rhythm. Bakers, too, transformed the street. Bread was a daily necessity, and ovens were central to neighborhoods and households in different ways depending on place and status. Baking required fuel. Fuel meant wood, charcoal, brush, or other materials moving through streets and stored near buildings. Ovens meant smoke, ash, heat, and fire risk. The smell of bread may seem comforting to us, and it likely did to many medieval people as well, but the system around it was not soft. It demanded transport, labor, soot, and constant attention. A town that smelled of bread also smelled of the fuel that made bread possible. Smiths and metalworkers brought sound into the conversation. The filth of their trade was not only waste but noise, heat, smoke, sparks, and the pressure of heavy work in crowded space. Iron tools, nails, hinges, horseshoes, knives, locks, fittings, and repairs were essential. But a smithy was not a quiet neighbor. Hammering, charcoal smoke, and the movement of customers, animals, and materials made it a strong presence in the street. Once again, the town accepted discomfort because the work was necessary. If we imagine these trades not as isolated shops but as parts of a living urban fabric, the medieval street becomes more understandable. One lane might carry the smell of fish, another the sharpness of tanning, another the smoke of ovens or forges, another the damp odor of cloth work, another the mix of animals and market produce. People navigated these districts with knowledge. They knew where to buy, where to avoid, where to hurry, where to complain, and where complaint was useless because the whole town depended on the work being done there. The location of trades could become part of a town's identity. Street names, guild structures, market arrangements, and local reputations often grew around specialized work. A visitor might understand a place by its craftsmen as much as by its churches or walls. But specialization also concentrated nuisances. What was convenient for customers and regulators could be unpleasant for residents nearby. A cluster of butchers, tanners, or dyers made oversight easier, but it also made the smell more intense in that district. This raises the question of whether medieval towns tried to separate clean from dirty trades. In some places, yes, to a degree. Authorities could restrict certain activities from central spaces, push offensive work toward waterways or edges, or regulate dumping. But the separation was never complete, and it often followed status more than abstract hygiene. Important commercial streets might be protected from the worst nuisances. Wealthy residents might resist undesirable neighbors. Poorer districts might absorb what others pushed away. The geography of smell often reflected the geography of power. The people working in these trades also deserve more careful attention. It is easy to treat them as sources of nuisance, but they were skilled workers, householders, employers, apprentices, and members of communities. A tanner's work might smell offensive, but it required knowledge. A butcher's trade demanded speed, judgment, and networks of supply. A dyer understood materials, color, water, and process. A brewer managed fermentation, heat, vessels, and timing. These people were not merely dirty figures at the edge of town. They were essential producers, their social standing varied. Some trades were profitable and organized. Others were looked down upon because of smell, dirt, or association with bodily matter. A craft could be economically necessary and socially stigmatized at the same time. That contradiction shaped how workers were treated and where they were placed. Medieval society often depended on people whose labor it preferred not to honor fully. This is another way filth reveals hierarchy. Apprentices learned this world directly. A young person entering a trade did not begin with polished finished goods. He or she began with errands, carrying, cleaning, scraping, stirring, fetching water, sweeping waste, tending fires, and enduring the smells of the workshop. Skill grew out of contact with materials in their roughest form. Modern consumers often encounter goods at the end of production. Medieval apprentices lived at the beginning, where matter was heavy, wet, smoky, and resistant. Workshops could spill into streets because interior space was limited and visibility mattered. A craftsman working near the front of a building could attract customers, receive light, and use the street as part of the workspace. But this blurred boundary made public space messier. Tools, benches, goods, waste, apprentices, and customers all competed with carts and pedestrians. The street became an extension of production. This blurring is important. We often imagine a street as a neutral passage between destinations. In a medieval town, the street itself was a destination and a workshop. It was not merely the space between buildings. It was part of the building's function. Work leaned outward. Goods leaned outward. Noise and smell leaned outward. The public street absorbed private enterprise because private interiors were too small, too dark, or too hidden for all the work that needed to be done. Urban authorities had to decide when that outward spill became unacceptable. A bench in the street might be tolerated if it allowed trade. A pile of hides might not be. A temporary cart might be allowed on market day but punished if it blocked a lane too long. Wastewater might be tolerated in a channel but not near a water source. Such rules required judgment, and judgment created conflict. The same act could be seen as livelihood by one person and nuisance by another. Guilds sometimes helped manage these tensions. Craft organizations could regulate quality, training, membership, and behavior. They could also represent collective interests to civic authorities. If a trade was accused of creating nuisance, a guild might defend its members or negotiate rules. Guilds gave crafts status and structure, but they did not remove the material realities of production. A well-organized craft could still smell badly. The market intensified all of this because it brought multiple trades into temporary contact. A market square might host food, cloth, metal goods, animals, fuel, second-hand objects, and traveling sellers. Each group had its own needs. Fish needed a place apart from bread. Animals needed room. Butchers needed surfaces and cleanup. Cloth needed protection from mud. Officials needed to preserve order. Buyers needed access. A busy market was a logistical achievement, not simply a colorful gathering. After the market, the ground told the story. Straw trampled flat, leaves crushed into mud, droppings mixed with soil, broken scraps near stalls, dirty water in channels. The day's prosperity became the evening's cleanup. If the town was well managed, the worst of it was removed. If not, it lingered into the next day. Markets created wealth in public and costs in public. The cleanup was part of the price. The same could happen after fairs, which were larger and more temporary. Fairs brought outsiders, animals, merchants, entertainers, pilgrims, officials, and crowds. They could be economically vital, but they placed enormous pressure on streets, fields, water, lodging, and waste disposal. A fair could briefly transform a town into something larger than itself, and then leave behind the traces of that expansion. The town benefited, but it also had to absorb the aftermath. This is where we can see how medieval people understood filth in terms of timing. A mess during a market might be tolerated because the market was active. The same mess left days later could become negligence. Waste from a trade might be tolerated if it was quickly moved. It became offensive when abandoned. Dirt after rain was expected. Dirt from laziness or disregard was not. Cleanliness was therefore not a fixed condition but a rhythm. What mattered was whether the rhythm of use and removal continued. When that rhythm failed, civic authority entered more sharply. Officials could order tradesmen to remove waste, forbid dumping in certain places, or fine those who created nuisances. Sometimes courts recorded disputes between neighbors over foul water, blocked drains, dangerous structures, or offensive trades. These records, when they survive, are valuable because they reveal people noticing, objecting, and negotiating. They also show that medieval streets were governed through complaint. Authority often reacted because someone had been affected enough to speak. But not all smells were equally actionable. Some were considered unavoidable features of a trade. A resident living near tanners could not expect the air of a garden. A person near a fish market could not expect the smell of clean linen. Custom mattered. If a district had long been associated with a trade, newcomers might have limited grounds for objection. But if a new nuisance appeared in a previously cleaner place, complaints could be stronger. The past use of a street shaped its accepted future. This meant that urban filth had memory. Once a place became known for a trade or dumping habit, that reputation could persist. Property values, social standing, and the kinds of residents who lived there might follow. A dirty district could remain dirty partly because it was already considered suitable for dirty work. This is how inequality settles into geography. A place becomes burdened because it has been burdened before. Still, people in those districts lived full lives. They married, raised children, joined parishes, trained apprentices, celebrated feasts, saved money, lost money, argued, prayed, and made goods that traveled far beyond their lanes. We should not reduce them to smell. To them, the workshop was also livelihood, family inheritance, skill, pride, and identity. A tanner might dislike the nuisance of his work and still take pride in good leather. A butcher might be watched by officials and still be an essential member of the market. A dyer might stain water and still produce colors that made garments desirable across the region. This double vision is necessary for trust in history. The same thing can be degrading and skilled, offensive and essential, regulated and respected, profitable and stigmatized. Medieval urban life was full of such contradictions. The street did not separate them neatly, placed them side by side. Consider wool, one of the great economic engines of medieval Europe. To modern eyes, a fine woolen cloth in a merchant's hall may suggest refinement. But before it reached that point, it had passed through sheep, shearing, sorting, washing, carding, spinning, weaving, fulling, dyeing, drying, finishing, packing, and transport. At every stage, people handled dirt, grease, water, tools, fibers, and residue. The final cloth concealed a long chain of labor. The street, especially in textile towns, exposed pieces of that chain. The same was true of leather. A finely made shoe might seem like protection against the filth of the road. But its material came from a process many people wanted kept away from their homes. A belt holding a purse, a harness pulling a cart, a sheath protecting a knife, and a book binding in a scholar's room all depended on work that could foul water and air. Medieval material culture was not clean at its roots. It was transformed into usefulness through unpleasant labor. Food also concealed transformation. Bread required grain grown in fields, transported by carts, milled, stored, kneaded, baked, and sold. Meat required animal husbandry, movement, slaughter, cutting, preservation, or quick sale, cooking, and cleanup. Fish required catching, transport, salting, or fresh sale, and disposal. Ale required grain, water, fuel, yeast, vessels, and storage. The medieval street connected each chain. It was where raw materials became goods and goods became waste. This makes the street a kind of archive, not an archive of parchment, but of residue. Mud recorded traffic. Smell recorded trade. Ruts recorded carts. Ash recorded fires. Stains recorded work. Heaps recorded failure or delay. Paving recorded investment. Complaints recorded social tension. The town wrote itself on the ground every day. Modern people often want the medieval past to look either charming or disgusting. The street resists both simplifications. It can be charming in form and disgusting in smell. Can be lively and hazardous. Can be beautiful in a morning light and difficult underfoot. It can support community and spread nuisance. Can be regulated and still dirty. Can be filthy and still functional. This mixture is what makes it historically real. In the working districts, the mixture becomes intense because production cannot be hidden. A dyer's vat, a butcher's stall, a smith's forge, a brewer's vessel, a tanner's pit, a fuller's workspace, and a fishmonger's table all show the town making itself. The street around them becomes a zone of transformation, where materials change state and value. Raw becomes finished. Living becomes food. Hide becomes leather. Fiber becomes cloth. Grain becomes drink. Fuel becomes heat. But with every transformation, something unwanted is produced too. The unwanted thing had to be managed, and management often depended on people of lower status. Apprentices carried, servants scrubbed, laborers carted. Women in households cleaned up after production and consumption. Rakers moved what others wished not to see. The more prosperous the trade, the more hidden labor it might require. A wealthy merchant's clean ledger was built on many dirty hands. This is not a moral condemnation from the present. It is a recognition of structure. Medieval society organized labor in ways that made some people responsible for the discomfort of others. The street shows that structure plainly. Those with more power could often stand farther from the worst smells while still benefiting from the goods. Those with less power remained near the processes. There were exceptions and variations, of course. Some skilled craftsmen achieved wealth and civic influence. Some trades formed strong guilds. Some workers owned property, held office, or gained respect. Medieval society was not a simple ladder with every dirty job at the bottom. But the association between foul materials and lower status was strong enough to shape neighborhoods, reputations, and regulation. What is striking is how necessary those lower forms of work were. Without them, the town's respectable life could not continue. The church needed candles. The scholar needed parchment and bindings. The rider needed harness. The merchant needed sacks and straps. The household needed shoes, pots, knives, bread, ale, cloth, soap, and fuel. The cleaner-looking parts of town depended on the dirtier parts. This dependence could become visible during shortages. If fuel failed to arrive, ovens and hearths suffered. If leather production faltered, shoes and harness became harder to obtain. If markets were disrupted, food supplies tightened. If waste removal broke down, streets worsened quickly. Medieval towns lived close to the edge of inconvenience. The systems that supported them were resilient in some ways, but fragile in others. A blocked watercourse near a working district could become especially serious. It might interfere with trade, intensify smell, and create conflict between craftsmen and neighbors. Cleaning it required agreement, labor, and often money. If the watercourse served multiple users, each might blame another. The more valuable the work, the more difficult the politics. No one wanted the nuisance, but many wanted the profit. This is why medieval civic records can feel repetitive. Again and again, they return to street repair, blocked gutters, unlawful dumping, animals, waste, paving, markets, and offensive trades. The repetition is not boring if we understand what it means. It shows a town constantly trying to keep its own activity from overwhelming itself. The mess was not outside the system. It was produced by the system's success. By late afternoon in a working district, the senses would have been full. Smoke from ovens and forges, damp air near water, the smell of hides, fish, animals, grain, ash, and human sweat, apprentices moving quickly, customers bargaining, officials watching, dogs waiting near scraps, carts pressing through, neighbors enduring what they could not easily change. Somewhere a bell marking time, somewhere a household trying to prepare an evening meal while the street outside carried the remains of everyone else's work. And as the day turned, another question emerged. What happened when all this material, all this waste, all this smell, all this residue did not simply sit in the street or leave by cart, but entered the rivers, ditches, wells, and underground spaces of the town? Because the medieval street was only the visible surface of the problem. Beneath and beside it lay the hidden geography of pits, drains, cesspools, channels, and waterways. The places where the town tried to send what it could no longer bear to keep in view. Beneath and beside it lay the hidden geography of pits, drains, cesspools, channels, and waterways. The places where the town tried to send what it could no longer bear to keep in view. And this hidden geography is where the medieval street becomes most revealing, because the surface filth was only the part people could step around. The deeper problem was what happened when waste sank, seeped, flowed, or gathered somewhere just beyond ordinary sight. A medieval town did not always have nothing beneath it. That is another common misunderstanding. There were drains, culverts, ditches, gutters, privy pits, cesspits, and water channels of different kinds, depending on the wealth, age, geography, and ambition of the place. Some were carefully made. Some were rough. Some were private. Some served institutions. Some were little more than improvised trenches. The issue was not that medieval people never tried to move waste away. The issue was that every method of moving it away created a new place where it could become someone else's problem. A cesspit, for example, could seem like order compared with waste in the street. It collected what people did not want in houses, yards, or lanes. It created a boundary between the living space and the foulest matter. But it needed space, lining, maintenance, and emptying. If badly built or neglected, it could leak into surrounding soil. If placed too close to water sources, it could threaten wells. If left too long, it became more difficult and more offensive to manage. The pit solved one problem by creating a future obligation. That future obligation often belonged to people with little status. Emptying pits, clearing drains, and moving foul matter required workers willing or compelled to handle what others avoided. Their labor kept the town from being overwhelmed. Yet their work was easily ignored because success meant disappearance. If they did their work well, the waste vanished from the respectable eye. If they failed, everyone noticed. This is one of the oldest injustices of sanitation. The people who preserve daily comfort are often remembered only when discomfort returns. Drains had their own fragility. An underground or covered channel might seem more advanced than an open gutter, and in some ways it was. It reduced surface nuisance, carried water more discreetly. It protected the street from some forms of obstruction. But drains could clog. They could collapse. They could be overwhelmed by rain. They could carry waste into rivers, ditches, or neighboring properties. To build a drain was not to end responsibility. It was to bury responsibility and make maintenance harder to see. Waterways received much of what towns wished to move away. A river, stream, or ditch could appear merciful because it carried matter onward. Flow gave the illusion of cleansing. The street looked better once waste entered water. But the river did not destroy everything it received. Transported it. Downstream users, fishers, washers, millers, brewers, and households could all be affected. Medieval towns understood this imperfectly but not blindly. They knew water could become foul. They knew certain uses conflicted. They knew that a river could be both a blessing and a dumping place. Here, the hidden contradiction of medieval cleanliness becomes especially clear. To make one street cleaner, a town might make one watercourse dirtier. To protect one frontage, it might burden one ditch. To move nuisance away from a market, it might increase nuisance near the edge of town. Cleanliness was often not elimination. It was redistribution, and redistribution followed power. Important spaces were defended first. Markets, bridges, civic routes, church approaches, and wealthy frontages could receive more attention than marginal lanes or river edges. The town's image mattered. Its trade mattered. The ceremonies mattered. But the waste removed from visible places still had to land somewhere. The medieval city did not simply contain filth. It arranged it according to need, status, geography, and force. This arrangement could become visible after heavy rain. Rain washed streets, but it also revealed their weaknesses. It filled low places, overwhelmed gutters, pushed waste into channels, softened unpaved ground, and carried matter toward ditches and rivers. What seemed tolerable in dry weather could become obvious in a storm. A blocked drain announced itself. A poor surface became mud. A neglected pit might overflow. A foul ditch spread its smell. Weather turned hidden failures into public facts. In dry weather, the town faced the opposite problem. Waste did not flow. It dried, crumbled, and mingled with dust. Ash, soil, dung, and powdered refuse could rise with passing feet, wheels, and animals. The street entered the air in another form. The same town that feared stagnant wetness could also endure choking dryness. Medieval filth was not one season, one smell, or one texture. It changed its form and continued. Against this constant transformation, people built habits. They chose routes. They watched the sky. They knew which streets were worst after rain, which wells tasted better, which alleys trapped smell, which trades to pass quickly, and which open spaces gave relief. The medieval town was navigated through memory as much as map. To live there was to carry a mental record of surfaces, risks, and tolerable discomforts. This kind of knowledge rarely appears in grand history, but it shaped life more intimately than many famous events. A person's day could be changed by a flooded lane, a blocked gutter, a dead animal left too long, a cart stuck in mud, a well temporarily fouled, a market space not yet cleared, or an official demanding that a frontage be swept. These were not dramatic moments in chronicles. They were the small frictions through which urban life was actually lived. And over time, those frictions pushed towns toward more regulation. Not all at once, not evenly, and not in a straight line toward modernity, but gradually. Authorities learned that streets had to be inspected, paving assigned, dumping limited, trades watched, animals controlled, and water protected. They did not possess the full tools of modern sanitation, but they developed civic habits of responsibility. The dirty street helped teach the town what government was for. This is one of the deeper lessons of the subject. Urban government did not grow only from war, trade, taxation, or law courts. It also grew from mud, dung, smoke, smell, and blocked passage. A town council that wanted commerce had to care about streets. A town that wanted order had to regulate refuse. A A town that wanted honor had to clean for ceremonies. A town that wanted health, as people understood it, had to worry about foul air and water. Filth forced communities to define public responsibility. But those definitions were always incomplete. One official could fine a negligent householder. One raker could clear one lane. One regulation could restrict one trade. Yet the larger system of daily life kept producing more. The medieval town could never fully escape the material reality of its own survival. Every improvement met the next morning's traffic, the next market scraps, the next rain, the next cart, the next household's waste, the next animal driven through the gate. That is why the street remained a place of repetition. It was swept and dirted, cleared and blocked, regulated and ignored, complained about and tolerated. This repetition may sound frustrating, but it is also deeply human. Most of urban history is maintenance, not transformation. The dramatic invention comes later. The daily work comes first. Before great sewer systems, before modern paving, before piped water to every home, before public health boards and collection schedules, there were people with brooms, carts, shovels, buckets, orders, complaints, and tired bodies. If we return now to the original question, why medieval streets were so filthy and nobody complained, the more truthful answer is that people did complain, but complaint alone could not remake the world. They complained when a neighbor's waste crossed a boundary. They complained when a gutter blocked. They complained when a trade became too offensive, when water was threatened, when a passage failed, when the smell became intolerable, when danger entered ordinary movement. But they also accepted what could not yet be removed without destroying the systems that fed, clothed, warmed, and employed them. Their acceptance was not ignorance. It was realism under constraint. They knew mud was unpleasant. They knew stench mattered. They knew waste could dishonor a household, damage trade, or threaten health as they understood it. But they also knew that horses pulled carts, pigs ate scraps, fires made smoke, tanners made leather, butchers supplied meat, brewers made drink, dyers colored cloth, markets fed towns, and water had to carry something away. To demand a clean medieval street in the modern sense would have been to demand a different technology, a different economy, and a different relationship between people and waste. This is what makes the medieval street so powerful as a historical image. It shows a world before concealment. Modern cities still produce unpleasant byproducts, but most people rarely meet them directly. Sewage flows through pipes. Waste is collected in trucks. Animals are kept away from most streets. Slaughter, tanning, industrial production, and large-scale waste processing happen beyond ordinary view. The modern street appears clean partly because entire systems work to hide the material consequences of daily life. The medieval street did not hide them well. It placed them underfoot, beside doorways, in gutters, near markets, along rivers, and at the town's edges. This is why it shocks us, but it also tells the truth with unusual honesty. A town is not only its cathedral, walls, guild hall, and market charter. It is also its drains, its mud, its sweepers, its animals, its pits, its smoke, its complaints, and its smells. The beautiful and the foul were built together. There is no need to romanticize that world. Medieval streets could be harsh, uncomfortable, unhealthy, and exhausting to navigate. The poor often bore the worst of it. Workers in foul trades endured conditions others avoided. Women, servants, apprentices, and laborers performed much of the repetitive cleaning and carrying that made life manageable. Disease, fire, darkness, and crowding were real dangers. The past does not become wiser because it was difficult. But there is also no need to laugh at it as if people were foolish for not inventing our world sooner. Medieval townspeople lived with intelligence inside their limits. They made rules. They assigned duties. They protected wells. They cleared markets. They punished nuisances. They moved waste where they could. They adapted to weather, animals, trades, and crowded streets with practical knowledge learned through daily experience. Their streets were filthy, but not meaningless. And perhaps the most thoughtful way to leave this world is to imagine it at the end of an ordinary day, not at its worst and not dressed for ceremony. The market has thinned. The last carts move slowly toward the gate. A baker's oven is still warm. A dog noses at the edge of a lane. Smoke hangs low between timbered houses. A servant carries water. A shopkeeper pulls in goods from the front. A raker has left a cleared patch that will not stay clear for long. Somewhere, a bell calls the town toward evening. The ground is still uneven. The gutter still carries what it can. The air still holds the day's mixture of work, animals, food, fuel, dampness, and human closeness. People step around the worst places without surprise. They know the street. They know its smells, its dangers, its shortcuts, its annoyances, and its uses. It is not clean in our sense, but it is alive in theirs. That is the final contradiction at the heart of medieval urban filth. The street was dirty because it was used. It was unpleasant because it was productive. It was complained about because people cared. It endured because the systems that made it foul were also the systems that kept the town fed, clothed, heated, supplied, and connected. What looks like neglect from a distance was often the visible edge of survival. So when we picture a medieval street, we should not see only a filthy lane from a modern joke or a romantic alley from a tourist postcard. We should see a working environment, crowded with compromises. We should see a place where public health, trade, class, labor, weather, technology, and human patience all met underfoot. We should see the town trying, failing, adjusting, and trying again. And maybe the question worth carrying away is not simply how medieval people tolerated such streets, but what our own clean streets have taught us not to notice. Every age produces waste. Every society decides where to put it, who must handle it, and how much of it the comfortable are allowed to ignore. The medieval street makes that arrangement visible. It reminds us that civilization has always depended not only on grand buildings and famous names, but on the quiet, difficult work of managing what daily life leaves behind. If one detail from this world stayed with you, the muddy markets, the hidden pits, the foul trades, the night watch, or the workers who kept the streets just usable enough, you are welcome to share it below, along with the history topic you would like to hear next. And if you enjoy calm, thoughtful journeys into the uncomfortable realities of the past, you can subscribe for more quietly fascinating history told at this slower pace. For now, the medieval street remains behind us. Narrow, smoky, muddy, crowded, and alive. Not clean, not simple, but deeply human.